$12,000 disappeared from my woods before breakfast, and the woman who ordered it had no idea she was about to turn that mistake into a $36,000 bill. The first thing I noticed wasn't the damage. It was the silence. I shut off my pickup at the edge of the North Grove and sat there with one hand still wrapped around the key, listening. Late February in Vermont is never truly quiet. Snowmelt ticks from bare branches. Chickadees chatter somewhere above the tree line. Tires settle into frozen gravel with tiny pops. But one sound was missing. The steady electric hum of my vacuum pump pulling maple sap through nearly 3 miles of blue tubing. I stepped out, and the cold hit hard enough to sting my teeth. My boots sank into 4 inches of dirty snow as I headed downhill. Then I saw the first line. Blue plastic tubing lay across the ground like somebody had dragged a rope through the trees and abandoned it. A fitting dangled from a maple 10 feet ahead. Another line had been yanked loose and twisted around a stump. I stopped walking. My coffee suddenly tasted like metal. That system had cost me just over $12,000 to install, not counting the weekends I'd spent crawling across 62 acres with tools hanging from my belt. It wasn't decoration. It carried sap from hundreds of tapped maples down to my sugar house, and the season was days away from opening up. I followed the tubing deeper into the grove. Every 50 feet, it got worse. Main lines had been disconnected. Support wire sagged between trees. Plastic junctions I'd installed by hand were scattered across the snow. Then I reached the access trail and found tracks. Excavator tracks. Fresh ones. The steel treads had chewed 2 dark paths through the thawing ground, leaving the sharp smell of wet soil and diesel hanging beneath the maples. Whoever had done this hadn't wandered onto my property by accident. They had brought equipment. They had brought workers. And judging by the clean cuts and organized piles of tubing, they'd had instructions. That's when I spotted the orange survey stake. It was still standing exactly where my surveyor had driven it 3 years earlier, bright against the snow. The machine tracks crossed directly past it. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Tubing. Track stake. Trees. Wide shots first, then close-ups. 30 yards farther down the trail, I found the thing that changed my confusion into something colder. A laminated white notice had been stapled to a wooden post. Silver Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Beneath the logo, in neat black letters, it read, Unauthorized utility lines removed from community woodland buffer. I read it twice. Then I looked through the trees toward the expensive rooftops of Silver Ridge Estates on the neighboring property. Their woodland buffer ended at the orange stakes. My maple grove began on the other side. Diane Whitmore knew that. I'd shown her the survey myself. I took one final photograph of the notice, slipped my phone back into my jacket, and listened to the empty woods. Diane thought she'd cleaned up an eyesore. What she'd actually done was leave her name attached to $12,000 of property damage, and before this was over, restoring what she ordered removed would cost her HOA $36,000. The Maple Grove had been part of my family longer than Silver Ridge Estates had been an idea on a developer's blueprint. My grandfather, Walter Caldwell, bought the first 40 acres in 1968, back when this stretch of northern Vermont was mostly dairy farms, logging roads, and neighbors who knew exactly where one property ended and another began. My father, Henry, added 22 acres after I was born. He never called himself a maple producer. He was a carpenter who happened to own enough sugar maples to make March smell like wood smoke and boiling syrup. When I was 9, he handed me a brace and bit and showed me how to tap my first tree. I remember the rough wooden handle against my palm, snow soaking through my boots, and that first clear drop of sap gathering at the edge of the spout. Dad caught it on his finger and told me to taste it. Barely sweet, cold as the air. I expected syrup and got something closer to water. He laughed. Good things take time, Ethan. That sentence stayed with me. For years, we collected sap with metal buckets. Hundreds of them. On warm afternoons after freezing nights, the grove sounded like 100 tiny clocks as drops struck galvanized steel. By the time I was 23, I was working as a utility line technician, climbing poles, tracing faults, and learning that a system only works when every connection does its job. Dad was getting older, so I started modernizing the sugar operation. First came lateral tubing, then main lines, then a vacuum pump that pulled sap downhill toward the sugar house. I spent weekends measuring slopes, replacing fittings, tensioning support wire, and learning every contour of those 62 acres. Dad complained that blue tubing made his woods look like a science experiment, but the first season our yield jumped, he stopped complaining. I still kept one short section of his old bucket line near the sugar house. 3 trees, 3 metal buckets. Completely inefficient, completely unnecessary. I kept them because some things do not have to make financial sense to matter. Dad died 6 years ago, and the property came to me. By then I was 43, divorced, tired of utility emergency calls at 2 in the morning, and ready to build something that belonged to me. I expanded the maple operation carefully. Nothing industrial. No tour buses. No gift shop. Just good equipment, healthy trees, and enough production to supplement my income every spring. Then developers bought the old pasture east of my property. Trees disappeared. Roads appeared. Within 18 months, Silver Ridge Estates had 38 large homes, decorative stone entrances, matching mailboxes, and an homeowners association that seemed convinced neat landscaping could rewrite property lines. At first, I barely noticed them. Their nearest house sat more than a quarter mile from my sugar house. Then residents started using the woodland trail near my eastern boundary. Then came questions about my equipment. Then complaints about blue tubing being visible through the trees. And eventually, Diane Whitmore showed up. The first time she stood beside one of my orange survey stakes, she smiled at me as if the boundary were merely a suggestion. I should have understood then. Diane did not see my family's maple grove when she looked west from Silver Ridge. She saw unfinished landscaping. Diane Whitmore introduced herself on a Saturday morning in early January, 3 weeks before I found my maple lines on the ground. I was checking vacuum connections along the eastern slope when I heard tires crunch over frozen gravel behind me. A white Lexus stopped beside the access trail, polished so clean it looked ridiculous against the salt-stained snowbanks. Diane stepped out wearing a cream winter coat, dark leather gloves, and boots that had probably never seen mud on purpose. She carried a clipboard against her chest. "Ethan Caldwell?" she asked. I nodded and kept tightening the fitting in my hand. "I am Diane Whitmore, president of the Silver Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." She said the title slowly, like she expected it to unlock something. I already knew who she was. Her name had appeared beneath 3 emails about my maple tubing over the previous month. The first called it a visual concern. The second called it non-conforming infrastructure. The third requested removal before the spring real estate season. I had answered each message with the same fact. My property was not part of Silver Ridge Estates. Diane looked past me at the blue lines running between the maples. "Several homeowners have expressed concerns about this equipment being visible from our walking trail. Then they can look the other direction," I said. Her smile tightened. "We are trying to maintain a natural woodland aesthetic." I set my wrench inside my tool bag. Cold air carried the clean smell of snow and maple bark between us. "This is a working sugar bush, Diane. Those lines collect sap. I understand that, but this section falls within our woodland buffer." She tapped her clipboard. That was when I walked her 20 yards east and stopped beside one of the orange survey stakes. The fluorescent paint was bright enough to see from the trail. I pointed toward Silver Ridge. "Your property is that side." Then I pointed toward my trees. "Mine is this side." Diane barely glanced at the marker. "Our documents show maintenance rights extending through the buffer." "Maintenance rights are not ownership." I think our attorney would disagree. I almost smiled. For 15 years, I had worked around utility easements, municipal rights of way, access agreements, and property maps. I knew how quickly people confused permission to enter land with permission to control it. I also knew arguing beside a frozen trail would accomplish nothing. "Send me the document," I said. "I will read it." Diane studied me for a second, probably expecting anger. When she did not get it, she changed tactics. "Nobody is trying to cause trouble, Ethan. Silver Ridge has standards. People invested a great deal of money to live here." I looked at the tubing behind me. So did I. Her perfume lingered after she returned to the Lexus, floral and strangely sharp in the cold air. That afternoon, an email arrived containing a highlighted subdivision map. The yellow shading extended into my woods, but there was no deed attached, no recorded survey, and no language granting Silver Ridge ownership of anything west of the boundary. I replied with my recorded plat and a survey completed 3 years earlier. I circled the eastern property line and included photographs of the orange stakes. Diane never acknowledged them. Instead, Days later, I received a formal notice demanding that all visible maple collection equipment within what she called the community woodland buffer be removed within 14 days. I printed the notice, dated it, and placed it in a folder. At the time, I thought I was documenting an annoying boundary dispute. I did not yet understand that Diane had already decided a line on her landscaping map mattered more than a line recorded at the county office. 4 days after Diane ignored my survey, I found fresh tire tracks crossing the eastern boundary. They were narrow at first, probably from a utility vehicle, and they stopped beside 3 of my main lines before turning back toward Silver Ridge. Nothing had been damaged yet, but somebody had walked the grove. I could see boot prints around the trees and small orange ribbons tied to branches about chest high. The ribbons were not mine. I pulled one loose and rolled the plastic between my fingers. Somebody was marking my equipment. I photographed everything, removed nothing else, and drove back to the sugar house. The next morning, I called the Silver Ridge management office. Diane answered on the 3rd ring. I asked whether she had sent anyone onto my property. "We had a contractor inspect the woodland buffer," she said. No hesitation. "You sent a contractor across my surveyed boundary?" There was a pause just long enough to matter. "Ethan, we have already explained our position." I looked through the sugar house window at steam curling from my coffee. "Your position is not a property right." Her voice cooled. "The board has authorized corrective maintenance." I wrote those words on the back of an envelope. Corrective maintenance. "Do not remove my equipment," I said. "I have provided the recorded survey. If you believe you have an easement that allows removal, send it to me before anyone touches anything." Diane gave me the same polished answer people use when they want a conversation to sound finished. "We will proceed according to our governing documents." Then she hung up. That afternoon, I drove the eastern boundary and photographed every orange survey stake from north to south. I measured the distance from the stakes to the nearest main line. Most of my tubing sat 30 to 70 feet inside my property. There was no gray area, no misplaced line hanging over a fence, no confusing corner where 2 parcels met. The next week stayed quiet. Temperatures dropped below 0 at night, and I spent my mornings replacing worn fittings and checking the pump. By Thursday, I almost convinced myself Diane had spoken to somebody with common sense. Then Friday morning, a neighbor from Silver Ridge named Tom Mercer called me. Tom had bought one of the first houses in the development and occasionally stopped by for syrup. "There is equipment near your woods," he said. "Small excavator and a utility trailer. I thought you should know." I was 35 miles away picking up filters and food-grade tubing. I turned the truck around. By the time I reached the grove, the equipment was gone. The snow near the boundary was churned into brown slush. Several orange ribbons had appeared deeper among my trees. My tubing was still intact, but now I could smell diesel where there should have been nothing but cold bark and snow. I emailed Diane immediately. I attached the survey again. I attached photographs again. I wrote one sentence in plain English. "You do not have permission to remove, relocate, disconnect, or alter any maple collection equipment on the Caldwell property." I copied the property management company and saved the sent message as a portable document file. 3 days later, the weather forecast changed. Warm afternoons were coming. Sap season was about to begin. I spent Sunday evening in the sugar house checking gauges while the vacuum pump hummed steadily behind me. Before leaving, I switched off the lights and listened to that familiar machine for a few seconds. By sunrise the next morning, that sound was gone. By 9 that morning, I had photographed every damaged section I could reach without moving a thing. Then I found the envelope. It was tucked beneath the laminated notice on the wooden post, sealed inside a clear plastic sleeve with my name printed across the front. The paper inside carried the Silver Ridge logo and Diane Whitmore's signature at the bottom. According to the letter, the Homeowners Association had completed what it called emergency landscape remediation within the community woodland buffer. Then came the part that almost made me laugh. They wanted me to pay for it. $840 for contractor labor, equipment use, debris handling, and administrative costs. They had crossed a surveyed property line, removed equipment after receiving written notice not to touch it, and somehow decided I owed them money for the privilege. I folded the letter carefully and put it back inside the sleeve. Anger would have been easy. Documentation was better. 2 nights later, Silver Ridge held its monthly board meeting at the community clubhouse. I arrived 10 minutes early carrying one folder and wearing the same work boots I had worn in the grove. The room smelled like coffee, carpet cleaner, and somebody's expensive perfume. About 20 homeowners sat in folding chairs while Diane occupied the center seat behind a long table. She looked surprised to see me, but only for a second. When public comments opened, I stood and asked one question. Did this board authorize the removal of maple collection equipment from the Caldwell property? Diane leaned toward her microphone. The board authorized restoration of the woodland buffer. That was not my question. A few heads turned. Diane's expression hardened. The equipment was located within an area Silver Ridge is responsible for maintaining. I held up a copy of my survey. I sent this to you twice. Did you receive it before the work was performed? She glanced toward the property manager. We received several documents from you. Including this survey? Yes. The room went quieter. I could hear the heating system clicking behind the wall. And after receiving it, you still authorized the contractor? Diane straightened in her chair. We acted according to our understanding of the association's rights. I nodded once. Please include that statement in the meeting minutes. She blinked. Excuse me. Your statement that the board received my survey and proceeded with the removal anyway. I would like it included in the official minutes. The property manager started writing. Diane looked at him, then back at me. For the first time since I had met her, the confidence slipped slightly. Not much. Just enough. She recovered quickly and announced that Silver Ridge would continue enforcing its maintenance standards. I did not argue. I did not threaten anyone. I thanked the board and walked out. The cold outside felt clean after the overheated clubhouse. Snow squeaked beneath my boots as I crossed the parking lot. The next morning, the association emailed me another notice warning that reinstalling the maple lines could result in additional remediation charges. I printed that one too. Then I placed it beside Diane's first demand, my survey, my photographs, and the $840 invoice. By then, I had stopped trying to convince her she was wrong. I wanted a complete record of exactly how certain she was. Edit the morning after the board meeting, I cleared my kitchen table and stopped treating the mess like a neighborhood argument. I treated it like a failed utility system. That was something I understood. For 15 years, my job had taught me the same rule every time a line went down. Do not guess, do not disturb the evidence, and measure everything before you repair anything. I spread the recorded deed, subdivision plat, my survey, photographs, invoices, and every email from Diane across the table. Coffee went cold beside my calculator while sleep clicked against the windows. First, I called Daniel Brooks, the licensed surveyor who had marked my eastern boundary 3 years earlier. He came out that afternoon with his equipment and spent nearly 4 hours checking monuments and measurements. When he finished, he planted fresh stakes beside the existing orange markers and handed me a preliminary field sketch. The conclusion was simple. The removed tubing had been entirely inside my property. In several locations, the contractor had traveled more than 60 feet beyond the Silver Ridge boundary. Next, I called a maple equipment company in Stowe and asked for a restoration estimate. Their technician, Aaron Pike, walked the grove with me the following morning. He did not just count tubing. He checked main lines, lateral connections, support wire, fittings, vacuum valves, anchors, and the slope that kept the entire system balanced. Every few minutes, he stopped and wrote another number on his clipboard. They did not remove a garden hose, he finally said. They dismantled a collection system. That distinction mattered. Replacing plastic was one cost. Restoring the system to working condition before the sap run was another. The first estimate came back above $18,000. Then Daniel's survey invoice arrived. Then Aaron found damaged anchors and sections of mainline that could not simply be reconnected. The number climbed past 24,000. I still had not counted the emergency labor required to rebuild during the narrow weather window. By the end of the week, documented restoration costs were approaching $31,000. That was when I called attorney Rebecca Sloan, a property lawyer in Montpelier. I carried the entire folder into her office. She read Diane's notices first, then my emails, then the survey. When she reached the board meeting minutes, she stopped. The minutes recorded that Silver Ridge had received my survey before authorizing the work. Rebecca looked over her glasses. They put that in writing? I asked them to. She read it again. Good. We sent Silver Ridge a formal demand to preserve all records connected to the removal. Board emails, contractor invoices, work orders, photographs, maps, and communications with the property management company. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just dates, documents, and a request that nothing be deleted. 2 days later, Silver Ridge forwarded the matter to its insurance carrier. That was the moment the tone changed. Diane stopped emailing me directly. The violation notices stopped. Even the $840 cleanup charge quietly disappeared from my online account. But I was not interested in a disappearing invoice anymore. I wanted the Grove restored correctly. I wanted every fitting tested and every main line returned to the condition it had been in before somebody crossed those orange stakes. Most of all, I wanted to know exactly what Diane had told the contractor before that excavator entered my woods. A week later, Rebecca called me. The contractor had turned over his work order and email chain. I could hear paper moving on her. Rebecca had the documents spread across her conference table when I arrived in Montpelier the next morning. Outside her window, dirty snow lined the curb and tires hissed over wet pavement. Inside, the room smelled like coffee and printer paper. She slid a 3-page email chain toward me. The first message came from Mark Ellison, owner of Green Mountain Property Services, the contractor Silver Ridge had hired. He had visited the site 6 days before the removal. His email to Diane was short and careful. He said several orange survey markers appeared to place the maple equipment outside association property, and he asked Silver Ridge to confirm ownership before his crew proceeded. Attached were 4 photographs. I recognized the first one immediately. My eastern boundary, my blue tubing, my orange stake standing between them and Silver Ridge. Mark had even drawn an arrow toward it. The second email was Diane's reply. She wrote that Silver Ridge maintained the entire woodland buffer and instructed him to proceed according to the board-approved cleanup plan. Mark answered again. He asked whether the association had documentation confirming authority to remove privately installed equipment beyond the marked boundary. Rebecca tapped that sentence with her finger. This is where it gets important. The final document was a work authorization form. Diane had signed it electronically the following afternoon. Under property authorization, she certified that Silver Ridge had the right to direct the requested work. I stared at her signature for several seconds. That was it. No hidden deed. No mysterious legal loophole. No misunderstanding caused by snow or an old fence. The contractor had noticed the boundary, questioned it, photographed it, and asked for confirmation. Diane had told him to continue anyway. Rebecca turned her monitor toward me. There was more. Mark's crew had taken time-stamped photographs before beginning work because his insurance company required job documentation. One image showed their utility trailer parked on the Silver Ridge side. Another showed the excavator crossing directly beside my orange stake. A third showed my main line still connected before removal. The timestamps matched the morning I had been 35 miles away buying supplies. Suddenly, every loose piece fit together. My survey established the boundary. The photographs established where the equipment had been. The contractor records established who ordered the work. Diane's emails established that she had been warned. The meeting minutes established that the board received my survey before the removal. Even the ridiculous cleanup invoice established that Silver Ridge considered the contractor's work authorized association business. Rebecca leaned back. Their insurance adjuster is going to have a difficult time calling this accidental. I looked again at Diane's signature. 4 weeks. She had acted as if confidence could substitute for ownership. Now her confidence had become evidence. That afternoon, the insurance adjuster called Rebecca and requested a complete restoration estimate. Aaron returned to the Grove with 2 technicians. This time they pressure tested the remaining lines and found vacuum leaks farther downhill where connections had been strained during removal. Several support wires needed resetting. 2 mainline sections needed replacement. The work would require a crew during the busiest weeks of maple season. When the revised estimate arrived, I opened it at my kitchen table. $34,680 before final survey and legal documentation costs. I could hear sleet tapping the glass again, almost exactly like the morning I started building the file. I thought about Diane standing beside that orange stake and barely looking at it. She had been given every opportunity to stop. Instead, she had signed a piece of paper telling someone else to cross it. The final number landed on a Tuesday afternoon, $36,000. I was standing inside the sugar house when Rebecca called, watching a thermometer creep above freezing while the first real warm spell of the season softened the snow outside. The insurance carrier had reviewed Daniel's boundary survey, Aaron's restoration estimate, the contractor photographs, the work authorization, Diane's emails, and the board minutes. They agreed to fund the documented restoration rather than drag the dispute any further. The amount covered replacement tubing, damaged main lines, fittings, support wire, anchors, vacuum testing, specialized labor, survey expenses, and the additional work required to return the system to its previous operating condition. I leaned against the workbench and listened while Rebecca explained the settlement terms. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly, I felt relieved. I had never wanted $36,000. I wanted the system I already owned before somebody decided a landscaping preference mattered more than a property line. 2 days later, Silver Ridge held a special board meeting. I attended because the settlement required the association to formally acknowledge the surveyed boundary and withdraw its claim that my grove was part of its maintainable woodland buffer. Diane sat in her usual chair, but the room felt different. No polished speeches about community standards. No confident references to governing documents. The property manager handled most of the discussion. A large printed copy of Daniel's survey rested on an easel beside the board table. The orange boundary line ran down the page like it had been waiting for someone to finally notice it. When the restoration payment came up, several homeowners shifted in their chairs. One man near the back asked why the association was paying so much to replace equipment that had originally cost far less. Diane started to answer, but the insurance representative attending by telephone explained it plainly. Removing an installed production system and restoring that system were not the same job. Labor had to be repeated. Damaged components had to be replaced. The network had to be tested. Survey work had been required. Emergency scheduling during maple season increased costs. The room went silent. I could hear the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Then Tom Mercer asked the question everybody seemed to be thinking. Were we warned about the property line before the contractor started? Diane looked down at her papers. The property manager answered. Yes. One word. That was all it took. I reached into my folder and pulled out the photograph Silver Ridge had circulated after the removal. It showed the cleared grove with a caption praising the restoration of the natural woodland appearance. Diane had once treated that picture like proof of success. I placed it beside the survey. That photograph was taken on my property, I said. Nothing more. I did not need anything more. The settlement documents were signed that week. Silver Ridge withdrew every notice against me, removed the cleanup charge permanently, acknowledged that its maintenance authority stopped at the surveyed line, and agreed that no association contractor would enter my land without written permission. Aaron scheduled his crew immediately. Trucks arrived carrying coils of blue tubing, boxes of fittings, support wire, and replacement valves. For 3 days, the woods filled with the sounds I actually wanted there. Boots on snow, tools clicking, technicians calling measurements between trees. Diane had spent weeks trying to make my working forest look untouched. In the end, her own paperwork paid to put every working piece back where it belonged. The first drop came at 11:17 on a Thursday morning. I remember the exact time because I was standing beside the vacuum gauge with one hand on the new main line when the needle steadied and the pump settled into that low familiar hum. For almost a month, every visit to the grove had begun with silence. Now the sound moved through the sugar house floor and into my boots like a heartbeat returning. Outside, the temperature had climbed to 38 degrees. Snow slipped from the metal roof in wet sheets. Sunlight flashed through bare maple branches, and somewhere uphill hundreds of taps were waking at once. I walked to the clear section of tubing beside the south wall and waited. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then a transparent bead appeared inside the line. It moved slowly downhill, joined another, then another, until a thin stream of sap traveled toward the collection tank. I laughed quietly, not because I had beaten Diane, not because Silver Ridge had written a check, because the system worked again. Aaron and his crew had rebuilt every damaged section carefully. New support wire ran straight between the trees. Fresh fittings held vacuum. The main lines followed the same slopes I had mapped years earlier. Along the eastern edge, Daniel's orange survey stakes remained exactly where they belonged. Only now Silver Ridge had installed small boundary markers on its own side, reminding maintenance crews not to cross without permission. Funny what $36,000 can teach people about a line they once refused to see. I walked uphill toward the oldest section of the grove. My father's 3 metal buckets were still hanging from their trees near the sugar house, completely unnecessary and wonderfully inefficient. One of them already had half an inch of clear sap inside. I lifted the lid and heard that old sound. Drip. Pause. Drip. For a second, I was 9 years old again, standing beside Dad with frozen toes, expecting maple syrup to pour straight from a tree. Good things take time, Ethan. He had been talking about syrup. I understood it differently now. I had kept one short piece of the tubing that had been removed. It was scratched, bent, and useless, so I cleaned it and hung it above the workbench beside Dad's old brace and bit. Not as a trophy, more like a reminder. Property lines are quiet things. So are deeds, surveys, invoices, emails, photographs, and meeting minutes. None of them raise their voices. They just sit there until somebody needs the truth. Silver Ridge became quieter after that spring. The walking trail stayed on their side. Contractors stopped appearing in my grove. Diane remained association president for another few months before deciding not to seek another term. I never asked why. I did not need to. By the end of March, steam rolled from the sugar house roof again, carrying that warm, sweet smell across the snow. I stood outside one evening with a mug of fresh syrup cooling in my hands and watched the last sunlight catch those orange stakes along the eastern boundary. Diane once looked at those markers and saw something she could ignore. She thought they marked the edge of a forest. What they really marked was the edge of her authority. And justice, I learned, does not always arrive with shouting or spectacle. Sometimes it sounds like maple sap moving through a line nobody will ever touch again. Thank you for watching this story. If Ethan Caldwell's patience, respect for his family's land, and determination to let the evidence speak for itself inspired you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who enjoy compelling HOA dramas and stories where careful documentation defeats arrogance, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable HOA conflicts, property rights battles, and real-life justice stories. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story about crossed boundaries, ignored warnings, and ordinary property owners who quietly stand their ground when someone else believes authority gives them the right to take what does not belong to them. Your support helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to life, and we cannot wait to share the next one with you. That if you were in Ethan Caldwell's position, would you have confronted the HOA immediately after discovering the damage, or would you have stayed calm, documented everything, and let their own emails, photographs, and paperwork prove exactly who was responsible? Tell us your choice in the comments and explain why.